Well, good afternoon and good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Akiwumi. I am the Director for Africa, Least Developed Countries and Special Programs in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I'm pleased to welcome you to this third session of the African Dialogue Series. Session is on the African Continental Free Trade Area as an opportunity for silencing the guns and overcoming COVID and other pandemics in Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are witnessing now how the COVID crisis is testing social and economic and the political resilience of member states today. As we speak now, countries are going into recession or are in recession. And there are estimates that there will be a 3% increase in the poverty headcount in Africa. Perhaps this is a new generation of inequalities which is emerging. And it is indeed very timely that we are having this discussion and having this session on these issues. Now, this session will discuss the potential benefits that the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area will provide to sustaining peace and development. And the discussions will also touch on critical issues such as the excess commodity dependence, economic diversification, and structural transformation, as well as industrialization. This will also include discussions on barriers to inter-African trade and pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa. Now, we are fortunate to have with us today lead presenters. And the first presenter is Mr. Albert Muchanga. He is the AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry. And the second presenter right now, we have Steve Karingi, Director for the Regional Integration Infrastructure and the Trade Division, who will be sitting in for Ms. Vera Songwe, who is Under Secretary General and Executive Secretary of UNECA until she arrives. In addition to that, we're fortunate to have as discussants Excellency Wamkele Mene, who is the Secretary General of the CFTA Secretariat, and Dr. Jackie Cillier, Chairperson of the Board and Head of African Futures and Innovation Institutions for Security Studies, as well as Dr. Raj Tajuddin, Head Public Health Institute and Research Center for Disease Control and Prevention, part of the African CDC. So because we have an ambitious agenda and we only have approximately an hour left, I would like to go straight into the presentations, and I'd first like to ask His Excellency Mr. Albert Muchanga, AU Chairperson, AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, to make his presentation. Thank you very much. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Are you able to get me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon. And I'm very happy that you very quickly corrected yourself. I'm not chairperson, I'm commissioner. The Undersecretary General for the Special Programs on Africa informed me that I got an invitation a month ago. Up to now, we've not been able to locate it, but when I was approached this week, I said there's no problem. So we are very happy to participate. And I'm not very sure if SG Wamkele is connected at this time, because when we are preparing, the information I got was that at the hotel where he's staying, there's some blackout. So there is a power cut. So if he is not connected, you should understand in that context his apologies. I think it is a very good topic that you have chosen, because this year, our theme in the African Union is on the issue of silencing the guns. And we see it as a very vital instrument in really promoting durable peace, security, and sustainable development. And as we look for a peaceful and secure Africa, then our ultimate objective is that when we have silenced the guns, we should be in a position where we ended all the civil wars, all the civil conflicts. We have ended gender-based violence and other conflicts, as well as institutionalized capacities in preventing genocide, which has been a feature in the history of Africa. And we see that there are many roads to silencing the guns in Africa. And one of those roads is delivering prosperity. And in this context, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a flagship program of the African Union Agenda 2063, can be leveraged to bring on the continent broad-based prosperity, and in so doing, contribute to silencing the guns. So let me go straight to the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The agreement establishing this organization has 8 general and 7 specific objectives. The 8 general objectives are the following: create a single market for goods, services, facilitated by the movement of persons in order to deepen economic integration of the African continent, and in accordance with the Pan-African vision of creating an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, as pointed out in Agenda 2063. The next objective is to create a liberalized market for goods and services through successful rounds of negotiations. And next, contribute to the movement of capital and natural persons and facilitate investments building on the initiatives and developments of the state parties and the regional economic communities. And then followed by the objective of laying the foundation for the establishment of a continental customs union at a later stage. And then promote and attain sustainable and inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality and structural transformation, as well as enhance competitiveness of the economies of the state parties within the continent and in the global market. Then promote industrial development through diversification and regional value chain development, agricultural development, and food security, and resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships and expedite regional and continental integration processes. Let me quickly turn to the 7 objectives, the specific ones. These are: 1, progressively eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade in goods. And 2, progressively liberalize trade in services. And cooperate on investment, intellectual property rights, and competition. And here we can add another element, which is electronic commerce. Then the next objective, specific objective, is cooperate on customs matters and the implementation of trade facilitation measures. And then followed by the need to establish a mechanism for settlement of disputes concerning their rights and obligations. And finally, establish and maintain an institutional framework for the implementation and administration of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Against this background of the specific and general objectives, 2 critical issues come out. The first one is that the African Continental Free Trade Area is a program of development. And the second one is that by integrating African economies and their countries, the African Continental Free Trade Area ultimately aims to defragment African economies by creating one African market. In both cases, we'll be generating large economies of scale and scope, vital to attracting large-scale and long-term investments. These will in turn accelerate development across Africa. If I can just give an example, a defragmented Africa with a population of currently 1.27 billion people, which is supposed to be 1.7 billion by 2030, becomes, at this point in time, the third biggest market in the world after China and India. Let me quickly turn to the status of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So far, 54 countries have signed the agreement and 28 have deposited instruments of ratification. At the Niamey Extraordinary Summit held on 7th July last year, our heads of state and government decided, among others, that we should roll out the market on 1st July 2020. This matter is under discussion given the presence of the COVID-19 pandemic in our midst. However, with that focus on rolling out to the market, a number of activities were agreed upon to ensure that we have a market of substance that is rolled out. The first one are the national level preparations, where member states were requested to produce and distribute trade documents as well as sensitize the business communities in their respective countries. And then we need to establish rules of origin, and we need to develop schedules of tariff concessions in trade in goods. And we need to develop and place in national gazettes the schedules of specific commitments in trade services. And we need to develop a non-tariff barriers monitoring and reporting and elimination mechanism, which we are going to roll out on 7th of July this year. And then we need to develop and test a pilot phase for the African Payments and Settlement Platform, and of course, operationalize the African Continental Free Trade Area Dispute Settlement Mechanism, and finalize arrangements for the establishment of an adjustment facility. An interim facility has been worked upon with the African Export-Import Bank with a capital base of $3 billion USD. And then operationalize the African Continental Free Trade Area. And in this afternoon, hopefully, we shall have SG Wamkele to join us in the discussion. He took office on the 19th of March this year. And then to ensure that there's continuing coordination at the regional level, the continental level, work is also underway to come up with a framework of collaboration involving the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, the regional economic communities, and the African Commission, among others. There are several ways of using the African Continental Free Trade Area to silence the guns in Africa. I'll begin by stating that advocates of free trade have long argued that its benefits are not merely economic. The advocates advise that free trade area also encourages people and nations to live in peace with one another. They also point out that free trade raises the cost of war by making nations more economically interdependent, because free trade makes markets more profitable for people in one nation to produce goods and services for the other people in another nation. In this state of affairs, parties either decided to swim together or sink together. It's against this background that we saw through history that countries that trade among themselves rarely go to war against each other. History has also taught us that soon after the Second World War, in 1945, countries realized that it was more important to cooperate than to fight. It was against this background that the world witnessed the drafting of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in 1947 with a dispute settlement mechanism. This framework agreement paved way for a stable and predictable multilateral trading system that involved formerly warring parties. It was a conscious realization that trade could be leveraged to rebuild nations and economies, as well as avoid future wars. Going into specifics, I would say that silencing the guns in Africa is aimed at creating a conducive environment for development. Succeeding in this is very vital for the African Continental Free Trade Area to be implemented effectively. This is because development requires durable peace and stability. As a development program itself, the African Continental Free Trade Area broadens the policy space for development, and in this connection, complements the program of Silence the Guns in Africa. With the African Continental Free Trade Area working on producing tangible benefits, Africa will be able to create conditions for ending poverty and unemployment. Let me also indicate that the African Continental Free Trade Area has huge potential in generating large and long-term investments and has been recognized by the African business. To this end, we are working with the Afro Champions Initiative to see if we can help them in implementing what they call the $1 trillion investment framework in support of African Continental Free Trade Area implementation. We are also requested to look at the issue of where we should be beyond the pandemic. One thing which comes out is that right now, there's a crisis in the commodities market. I think the only commodity that seems to be doing well is gold. And the prices of other commodities have collapsed. And just before the pandemic started, there was a flight of capital from Africa and other parts of the world, because capital is always a coward. Against this background, we don't foresee a huge surge of foreign direct investment, because a majority of foreign direct investment is in Africa is concentrated in the commodities sector. So the African Continental Free Trade Area offers the opportunity for structural transformation of the African economy. And this is going to be done by engaging in export diversification. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers opportunities for African countries to trade in value-added products among themselves. And this is the message that we are giving to the private sector. And it's also the message that we are giving to the governments, that they need really to work together to ensure that we mobilize African private sector to invest across Africa and take advantage of the market. And there are a number of operational instruments that can be used. First, to promote collaboration among governments, the private sector, and the academia on matters of research and development, to promote product design and development, also to promote quality infrastructure, and to promote marketing, branding, logistics, as well as reliable transport and communication networks across Africa. So this is what we are conveying. And against this background, in November this year, we are going to have the African Union Summit on Industrialization and Economic Diversification, which is being co-jointly organized by the African Union, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, as well as the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And here, we would like to ensure that we come out of that meeting with a focus on really ensuring that the investors, the manufacturers across Africa, harness technological capabilities for them to increase value addition across Africa. So this is where we are. And of course, when we have achieved this, the issue is how do we develop resilience? The lessons of this pandemic is that immediately it rolled out, the global supply chains were disrupted. And therefore, when we develop domestic and regional value and supply chains, and when we develop a trade anchored on trading across Africa, in the process, we should be able to come up with a mechanism of building resilience. And I think at a later stage, it will come out in the discussion that one of the initiatives which were taken was to mobilize the African Federation of Pharmaceutical Associations across Africa and other business people to see if they can engage in producing personal protective equipment so that we are able to meet some of the needs while trying to get the other supplies from abroad. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to engage in any discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Muchanga. Very insightful and informative presentation. I'd like to swiftly go on to Mr. Karingi so that we have more time at the end for some questions and comments. Mr. Karingi, you have the floor, sir.
Hi, so can you see my presentation, which Chair? Great, great. If you can see the presentation, Chair, I can continue. So good morning, good afternoon. I'm making this presentation on behalf of Ms. Songwe. She's going to join us shortly when she's able to. And I would want to start by basically giving you the numbers. We have been impacted as a continent, and we anticipate there's going to be a big impact on the economic growth of the continent. And this is coming mainly through the trade channel. And so it's good that we are discussing trade here and the role of the AfCFTA. The worst case scenario, as foreseen by the ECA, is an economic contraction of close to 3% in 2020. Now, we're talking trade, and trade is about moving goods across borders. We are also at the same time trying to control the pandemic. So what we see is that countries have taken measures in terms of controlling the exposure of the populations to the coronavirus. And as a result of that, there are quite a number of lockdowns, which we estimate if you were to close down the whole of the continent because of the coronavirus and the COVID-19, you would lose up to 2.5% of Africa's GDP every month. So the chair started by talking about the issue of poverty. Now, and we are talking about silencing the gun and control of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic found the continent already in a very precarious position when it came to the question of poverty. Of course, the continent has been making a lot of progress in terms of dealing with poverty in implementation, at least in the realization of the SDGs. However, the decline in the poverty rate has actually been very slow since 1990. Now, so we are finding ourselves as a continent in a situation whereby the pandemic is hitting the continent already in a weak situation, and the decline in poverty has actually been made much more difficult because of the nature of poverty that we have in the continent. So there are two sides to the question of poverty depth in the continent. So we have a lot of 60% of the African poor who are chronically poor, and then 40% who are in transient poverty. So what the pandemic is doing is actually to cause people who had already gone up beyond the poverty line to go down below the poverty line. According to our numbers, we see this number increased by about 20 million. And the probability of the people who go below the poverty line because of the pandemic, the probability of them getting out of poverty in the next 10 years is much lower than if there was no pandemic and we're trying to raise more people who are already below the poverty line above the poverty line. So this is the context in which we are talking about trade. Now, the second thing is that both the commissioner and the chair have actually talked about the issue of the commodity dependence. So already what the pandemic has done, because of the shutdown in the destination markets of the continent, and also because of the shutdown within the continent, most of the countries that depend a lot on the exports outside to the rest of the world, as you can see in this chart, like Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, especially in the area of crude oil, they are feeling the impact of the pandemic. And I think the commissioner has indicated that probably the only commodity that is not experiencing challenges in terms of the fall of prices is good. But there is a livelihood dimension to this. And this livelihood dimension has an issue related to security, and we will come back to that because we are talking about silencing the gun. So what is happening is that Africa still depends a lot in terms of sourcing its food from the rest of the world. So we have quite a number of African countries, especially the West African countries, that import most of their staple rice, the staple food, in this case rice, from Asia. There are shutdowns. There is no flow of trade because of export restrictions that some countries have imposed. We have countries in North Africa that depend on wheat imports, including from Russia, and we also see that there are export restrictions from there. Now, in the context of our health systems, the pandemic has basically come and exposed the continent to the challenges of having not already implemented the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. It has also exposed the continent for having not created a solid manufacturing base that would have allowed the continent to be ready to respond in terms of the COVID-19 supplies and the medicines that are required. So the continent is in a situation whereby 94% of the pharmaceutical are from outside, and we see the AfCFTA actually as something that as a platform, or at least as a tool that can help address the farmer challenge, or at least to help secure the health system for the continent. In the same way, even the basic things that we need as a continent, most of that is imported, as indicated there, from the thermometers to soaps. Some of the soaps, disinfectants, and unfortunately, some of them actually face tariffs. We believe that the AfCFTA, because of the creation of one market for the continent, will at least be able to reduce these tariffs so that if you're between one regional economic community to another one, at least there will be easier access to these goods. And we believe that it will play a role in securing our health system. Now, let me quickly talk about, very briefly say, Africa has actually not just been sitting down. You have seen a lot of efforts by the African government coming up with policy responses to deal with COVID-19, be it in the area of macroeconomics through fiscal stimuluses. Some of them have even reduced tax waivers and tax exemptions to at least to try to save the businesses. Because of course, even if the AfCFTA was to start trading, you want at least to ensure that there is a private sector that is capable of supplying to that market. We've seen elements to do with the monetary policy, including some areas in terms of the area of trade policies. Some countries have taken, at least to remove quickly, some of the barriers, tariff barriers, that would have made countries find it difficult to get supplies of the supplies they need to fight the disease. So Africa has actually been trying to do something. Now, coming to the theme then of this silencing the gun, the commissioner has already hinted to this. The AfCFTA is actually going to raise the opportunity cost of conflict in the continent. And this is because historically we know economic interdependence is important in at least making countries sit down even when we are having tensions. We have even seen this in our regional economic communities, especially in the crossing of the border by the truck drivers, because there is a regional platform through the regional economic communities. Heads of state are able to pick the phone and talk to each other. The AfCFTA is actually going to raise the opportunity cost of conflict. And I think there's a lesson here we can learn from Mercosur, whereby in 1991, Mercosur was formed because that time we had Argentina and Brazil under military power, and Mercosur was actually able to at least make it possible for leaders to speak to each other. And of course, we know the historical example of Europe. The other thing is that because of the dependence of the commodities and lack of diversification, there is always that exposure to the external shock or a systematic shock like the one we have seen under the coronavirus or because of the COVID-19. So the AfCFTA is actually going to provide a platform for trade diversification which at least will not only create jobs and make it easier for people to withstand a pandemic like the one we have, but it will also help to win Africa from the dependence on the extractives. And finally, still on the theme of AfCFTA, increasing the opportunity cost of conflict, it is going to encourage cooperation. And we have the example already of what is happening in our regional economic communities. In West Africa, ECOWAS in 1998 established the first regional moratorium on small arms. So you have a situation whereby a country in ECOWAS cannot import arms, new weapons, without approval from the other members. Now, we also know that when it comes to issue of security, food is usually one of the triggers of food riots that can easily lead to insecurity and people taking the arms, especially where there is political tension. So the AfCFTA is going to make food supplies more secure because it's going to open up the market. And finally, we know that trade agreements do not always keep the peace, especially depending on whether there is equal sharing of the benefits. So, but if you have a platform like the AfCFTA, it allows you to at least be able to see whether it is possible to have a conversation that addresses the issue of unequal trade. And also it also gives a platform for unregulated, to be able to regulate the free trade so that you do not have some of the groups being marginalized. So we see the opportunity, the AfCFTA being not only a platform, but also offering additional tools that would allow the African countries to be able to talk to each other. So that's what I was going to present, Chair. I know I have run through the slides, but we are happy to take questions, and also we will also be able to share these slides with the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve, and thank you for both very much, the lead presenters. I think it's quite clear that regional integration is one of the key elements to achieve structural transformation and resilience of economies to be able to deal with external shocks of this nature, be it economic shocks or health shocks. And I'm so happy to hear that the CFTA is now well on its way, and it is a tool, a framework for Africa to move forward on. Now I'd like to get straight on to the discussants. And I'm not sure whether Mr. Wamkele Mene is online yet. But if he is not, then I'd like to go to our second discussant, Dr. Jackie Cilliers, Chairperson of the Board, Head of the African Futures and Innovations Institute for Security Studies. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Very clear. Thank you
very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking to you from Pretoria in South Africa. And I think there's no doubt that COVID-19 will have a devastating impact on Africa and our ability to achieve the SDGs. Although, as we all know, the exact health and mortality impact at the moment is still very uncertain. So we are currently busy with a modeling exercise on the impact of COVID under different scenarios. And as a departure point, we take the IMF growth forecasts. As you know, last year, when the IMF in October released their growth forecast for Africa, they were expecting the continent to grow at about 2.6% this year. And I see that UNECA in the presentation that was just done used the IMF 2.6% as a worst case scenario. And then, of course, when in April the IMF released, when the IMF released their revised growth forecast, they are expecting Africa to decline and experience -3% growth in 2020. Now, earlier, a few weeks ago, the World Health Organization came out with a worst case mortality forecast that we could use of about 136,000 additional COVID-19 deaths in Africa in 2020. And we estimate that if we use the IMF growth forecast for 2020, probably an additional, there will be probably been about an additional 26,000 additional deaths from the decline in growth alone. But over time, the number of Africans dying as a result of the impact of slower growth will far outpace those that may die from COVID over the next few years, I think we all know. So our estimation is that if we use that IMF growth forecast of minus 3% growth in 2020, that Africa's economic size will probably decline by about 180 billion US dollars from the pre-COVID growth in 2020 alone. Average incomes will decline by about $280 per person compared to a pre-COVID growth forecast, and about 14 million additional Africans will fall into extreme poverty using the $1.90 extreme poverty line. In an intermediate scenario, and we are doing our forecast out till 2030, we expect extreme poverty in Africa to increase to about 635 million Africans by 2030, which is about 30 million more than we would otherwise expect. It's about equivalent to about 37% of the continent's total population. As we all know, only much more rapid and inclusive economic growth can impact upon these really alarming forecasts. In March of this year, just before the COVID pandemic hit Africa, I published a book called Africa First, Unleashing a Growth Revolution. And in this book, I modeled the impact of 11 scenarios on the future of Africa. One of the scenarios was the potential impact of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And then I had a second scenario where I modeled the impact of more stability. I call that silencing the guns, but in my view, stability and growth go hand in hand. So Africa will in part remain unstable because it is developing. Now, as you all know, the Continental Free Trade Area is only scheduled for full implementation by 2034. But the modeling that I did for that book would indicate that by 2030, even taking the COVID impact in consideration, Africa could on average be growing about 0.5% more rapidly than would otherwise be the case. So a 0.5% increase on average growth rates for all of Africa's 55 countries. And that would translate into an economy that by 2030 would be about $70 billion larger than would otherwise be the case. In other words, if we compare the current path with the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Of course, over time, that accelerates Africa, the size of the African economy, and the growth rates accelerate significantly over time. So I think it's very obvious that the full implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area is critical for a variety of reasons that previous speakers have unpacked with regard to stability, unlocking regional trade with higher value added, and so on and so forth. But I think the concern at the moment is that with all budgets being under pressure right at the moment, the challenge is, will our leaders avoid the temptation to step back from the rapid implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area to avoid the initial tariff loss that will inevitably follow the early years of implementation. And I think instead of a delayed implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Areas, leaders focus on the immediate budget. We really need to see COVID-19 as a wake-up call for more rapid implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is beyond leapfrogging and industrialization in the 11 scenarios that I have been modeling, the single most important contributor to change Africa's productive structures. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. And one of the issues I think that somewhere we need to tackle at one point in time is about the migrant laborers returning to Africa. Because as we know, remittances has been a big influx of funding into Africa, not just the cash remittances, but the social remittances as well. So that will have to somewhere need to tackle that in the future. But I'm happy to inform everybody that Ms. Vera Songwe, Undersecretary General and the Executive Secretary of ECA, has been able to make it to the event. And I'd like to give her the floor to add a few words before we move on with the last discussant. So, Madam Songwe, you have the floor. Hello?
Thank you. Yes, please. Can you see me? I'm trying to operate my camera.
I can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
Trying to get the camera on. Well, let me just keep talking. I think that what happened, I fully agree with the conversation on the remittances and just to close that part of the loop. But I also do want to say, as I maybe just re-emphasize listening to the last speaker, you know, what the policymakers have done. And as I talk to you, I'm still trying to put my camera on, but it's access to camera not allowed. I'm not sure why. Okay. So I think three things have happened. If you look at countries like Senegal, they've done $1.28 billion of stimulus. Cote d'Ivoire has done something in a similar amount. Ghana, $700 million. A country like Egypt, $6.3 billion of stimulus. So our countries and our policymakers, I think, have acted very quickly to respond to this. And I think part of the reason they've done that is precisely because of the fright of getting violence. Given that we're talking about trade and silencing the guns, I just want to say that policymakers are very, very clear that the importance of, you know, responding first to the economic crisis, which is also, I think, a jobs crisis. And we know, and we've done a lot of work that shows that when people are unemployed, the crisis levels go up. So essentially what we are looking at is a situation where policymakers have come forward, they've leaned forward to ensure that we can actually respond. Now, what we need is the international community. ECA and the Ministers of Finance have called for $100 billion in fiscal stimulus, another $100 billion to go to the private sector to see whether we can create more jobs. And I think one of the things that we must appreciate is the business sector. The private sector has come together really fast to keep some businesses open, to begin to produce PPE equipment, to produce ventilators. So there are jobs on the continent to ensure that people are employed in the agriculture sector, from Ethiopia, where we are, to Senegal, to Guinea. The agriculture sector is going on. Actually, even in South Africa, they've left the agriculture sector open so that some people can continue to get jobs. And I think this is the crux between the trade conversation, the COVID conversation, and the sort of silencing the guns conversation. We need to keep the jobs open. And my sense is that, you know, the call for a stimulus package, the call that the international community must keep businesses, must keep, and Africa in particular, we need to make sure that we can keep transaction routes open so that, you know, food can move, so that drugs can move, so that businesses can continue. Because there's no point talking about silencing the guns if we are not letting businesses work. And I think, as Stephen showed in his slides, one of the big issues is that, you know, we have countries where the depth of poverty is so deep that we cannot afford it to go any further down. So we need to sort of try to start seeing whether we can arrest that. And I think that is the work also that Commissioner Muchanga is talking about. We can begin to work virtually to push the CFTA. We can begin to ensure that some of the efforts and some of the initiatives we want under the CFTA happen, even as we fight the COVID crisis. I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This added considerably to our discussion. We will have an opportunity for questions afterwards, so I'd like to finish off with the discussants. And last discussant we have is Dr. Raji Tajuddin, the head of Public Health Institute and Research Center for Disease Control and Prevention, part of African CDC. Dr. Raji, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, can I share some set of slides?
Certainly.
Yeah, so it's disabled from my end, if it can be enabled from that side. Oh, perfect.
Okay, we see your slide.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me start by appreciating the distinguished excellencies, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen that are part of this discussion this afternoon. I bring you greetings from John Nkegason, Director of Africa CDC, who currently is in another meeting with the Ministers of Health, still focusing on how do we, as a continent, address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So by way of introduction, long before the pandemic, Africa CDC realized the importance of working together with the CFTA, that's the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So sometimes late last year, we brought together some experts as far as our trade on the continent is concerned, including Stephen himself, who today is a part of this panel, to discuss the public health implication of the AfCFTA. And of course, to also come up with what will be the role of CFTA in terms of addressing the recurrent and repeated epidemics on the continent. If I take you back slightly to the Assembly decision that is establishing the Africa CDC, that decision called on the need to promote partnership and collaboration among member states and to address emerging and endemic disease and public health emergencies. That statute also called on the need for us to work with partners, which is exactly what we are doing here today. Okay, so in terms of our strategy going forward, Africa CDC is approaching this pandemic issue from three main perspectives. One is prevent transmission, two, prevent death, and three, prevent social harms. The slide is changing. Okay, in terms of what we've done so far, we've been able to build the capacity of 2/3 of the African Union member states. So we're talking of close to 40 member states. And this capacity building is in terms of surveillance, in terms of case management, in terms of infection prevention and control, in terms of lab diagnostics, then risk communication, which are the key pillars as far as controlling this pandemic is concerned. And in terms of supply chain management, we've been able to support member states with close to 1.5 million lab test kits through the Jack Ma Foundation. And through the African Union, we have been able to support member states with 650,000 tests on the continent. Let me also say that at the outset of this pandemic or the epidemic, there were only 2 labs on the continent that could test for COVID-19. We are proud to say that today, 48 countries could do that, courtesy of Africa CDC together with our partners. So now we know that a lot of countries initially locked up and they are beginning to open up. So what do we do? Despite the fact that cases are going up, countries are opening up. So what do we do to make sure that we bring this pandemic under control? So some couple of weeks back, Africa CDC launched an initiative called Partnership for Accelerated COVID-19 Testing on the continent. And our aim here is to conduct 1 million tests in 1 month. I'm happy to say that today, in the first 1 month, we have been able to scale up to 1.2 million tests. And to also move up to 10 million tests in 4 months. To establish Africa-wide food procurement, 3, to establish storage and distribution hubs across the continent, and to support this initiative with 1 million health workers, and of course, to deploy technology to support or to back this our initiative. So in terms of testing, so you can see the trajectory there. Currently, we are at 1,200 tests per million population. This is far from what an ideal situation is. And in terms of positivity rate, I think we are doing well as far as that is concerned. We are about 5.5% positivity rate. So this is where we are coming from. About a month ago, we were just around 225 tests per million. Today, we are at 1,200. And where do we want to be? We want to go to 16,000 tests per million population at the end of the year. So why do we need to scale up testing? The main reasons are: 1, the testing is the only way you can identify and isolate every case. Is the only way you can trace contact, and it's also the only way you can uncover areas of concentration of cases. And more importantly, is the only way you can effectively and appropriately deploy treatment or case management, as the case may be. So this is just to unpack the PACT initiative further. So one of the things we'll be doing is to make sure that we trace each and every contact through deployment of community health workers, through engagement of the technological giant on the continent, and of course, to set up a robust surveillance system on the continent. We also know that for us to scale up and to bring this pandemic under control, infection prevention and control is key. So as part of the PACT initiative, IPC, or infection prevention and control, is also a key activity there. Then of course, test, isolate, and so what. We should be able to treat each and every case that we're able to pick. And this is the only way we can, as much as possible, reduce death. We have heard from modeling studies that is suggesting that 190,000 Africans will die from this pandemic if nothing is done. So what African CDC is trying to do through the case management pillar is to make sure that we reduce this death as much as possible. But we know that we cannot do it alone. So we rely on partners. And I believe that is part of the reason why we are holding this discussion today. In terms of human resources, our plan is at the end of the day to deploy 1 million health workers to back our initiative. And this will include different categories of staff. So I'm happy to say that for the start, we are deploying 150 epidemiologists. So these are senior public health physicians. And these are the people that will be supervising the first set of 100,000 community workers that will be deploying. And what these people will be doing is, one, to test, to trace, to track, and to treat each and every COVID-19 case on the continent. So let me shift gear a bit and go to clinical trial. We have talked about research. If you look at the map on your screen, you will discover that Africa is poorly populated as far as research is concerned. Of course, the reason is quite obvious. And again, looking at the distribution of the different clinical trials and research that is ongoing, Africa is nowhere is nowhere to be found as far as that space is concerned. So what do we have currently on the continent? We have 29 research or clinical trials going on, and Egypt is leading the pack with 17. So what do we want from CFTA, or African Continental Free Trade Area, as far as responding to the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent is concerned? We know that the supply chain management, it's a big issue at the moment. We know that there's global shortage of most of these medical supplies. And we also know that even if it's available, the price is not affordable to most member states. So we would like to work with CFTA to ensure that we put in place a continent-wide procurement platform that will allow our member states, to be able to assess the different medical supply that we believe will make a big change or will be able to bring this pandemic under control. 2, scaling up capacity for local manufacturing. The commissioner has talked about this. Steve has also talked about this. So we want to work with CFTA to ensure that our local companies are able to at least match some of these local needs in terms of manufacturing. For instance, things like PPE, test kits, oxygen, ventilators. What is it that our local manufacturers can bring to the response to the COVID-19 response going forward? 3, logistics for distribution. Even if these things are manufactured, even if we are able to do the procurement, how do we ensure there is equitable distribution to all member states? We know that a lot of borders are closed, airspaces are closed, major land crossings are closed. So how do we use the CFTA platform to ensure equitable distribution for most of these medical supplies? Then, of course, private sector engagement. We know that one of the things at the disposal or resources at the disposal of CFTA is enormous amount of private sector resources. So how do we deploy this to make sure that they also contribute their own quota as far as the continental strategy is concerned. And of course, the last but not the least, how do we deploy technology? This can be in form of research. This can be in form of scaling up our production. This can be in form of supporting our surveillance. So how do we deploy technology to bring this pandemic under control? We know we have tried manual in the past, but the scale of this pandemic does not allow for only manual approach to do the work. So we need to come up with innovative ideas. So to conclude,
Dr. Raji, we are running out of time. If you could wrap up, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so this is my last slide. So to conclude, I just want to make a statement on them silencing the gun. That health is a security, is a social, and it's an economic issue. We have seen it in DRC, we have seen it in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. And to silence the gun, we need health security. And for us to guarantee health security, we need all hands on the deck. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And you touched upon a point which is very critical. I believe that the African continent must have the productive capacity to start manufacturing some of these equipment that we need. And we've seen it in some of the countries when there's a crisis, ingenuity starts and people start producing things. So this is very important also with regards to CFTA. I'd like to now move, before we go into the open floor, is to move to the we have a list of predetermined speakers. And the first speaker I'd like to call upon is His Excellency Mimouni, for Permanent Representative of Algeria. Excellency, you have the floor. If Excellency is not on, can't hear me, or is not on, I'd like to move to the second predetermined speaker.
I think you were you calling me?
Yes, Excellency.
Yes. No, I'm here. Sorry, I was just trying to get off my mute mic. Yeah, no, I think first of all, again, because I was a little bit stressed the last time around, I forgot to say thank you so much for having me here. Greetings to Commissioner Muchanga, everybody else, Wamkele. I don't know if he has succeeded in joining us. Of course, USG Beans Gawanas for inviting us and for having this very interesting discussion at this time. I think it's a really important thing for us to continue to do the work that we do normally. Silencing the guns was the important conversation that we had at the beginning of the year. Back to the conversation on trade, my sense is, and I just heard from the CDC colleague about all the work that's been done to support PPE equipment on the continent. With Afreximbank and the ECA, we've been working on what we call the pool procurement system with the African Union and the Commissioner for Social Affairs and Commissioner Muchanga. And essentially today, as Stephen's slide showed, we import over 94% of our drugs from outside the continent. Some simple things like gloves, we make rubber on the continent. We should be able to transform, rubber to gloves and not imported from China. So my sense is that maybe the opportunity from this crisis, and I'm in the Build Back Better phase now, is how can we build back while ensuring, as the SG said in the recently released report on COVID in Africa, and I hope everybody has looked at the report. It's an amazing report from the SG on Africa. I think that what we can really do is use trade again to make sure that, one, we silence the guns, we create the jobs. We need 13 million jobs on the continent. But the other thing is that we do sustainable jobs. When we come back to Build Back Better, I talked about rubber. We need to make sure that we're not wasting water. There's a recent study that just came out that showed that we can save, with a $900 million investment, we can save $2.3 trillion worth of resources in better water, better energy, and create 13 million jobs for the continent. So really, I think there is hope, and we're learning how to do it better. We're learning how to do it more efficiently. Ethiopian Airlines today is doing all the freight for us. We don't have to go to FedEx and other things. So there really is, I think, the message I want to leave now is a message of hope. I think that what the crisis has shown us, and yes, we are still going through the humanitarian part of it. We're almost at 100,000 deaths infected on the continent. But I think that there is an innovation on the continent that we've never seen before. This innovation is linked to trade, is linked to the internet, and I think we can do more, we can do better, and there is hope on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Madam Songwe. Now I'd like to open the floor to anybody who would like to make any, ask any questions to the panel. Before that, I'd just like to ask whether the Deputy Perm Rep of Morocco would like to make his statement.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. No, I can't hear you anymore. Something happened.
Can you now?
I can hear you now. Excellent.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor. And I would like to express our sincere thanks to the panelists and the presenters. Indeed, this discussion have put the light on Africa's industrialization and trade opportunities in the context of COVID-19, and how we can further empower the African continental free trade area to overcome the multidimensional challenges of the current crisis. We know that Africa is a growing continental market with growing needs and capacities. For the past 5 years, the continent has ranked among the fastest growing regions in the world, despite the downturn in the global economy. The continent's real income has increased by 30% over the past 10 years. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 outbreak will slow down Africa's economic and trade growth. This is what all the panelists have said. And so this downturn will translate into less jobs and also decline in the provision of sufficient social services. The adoption of the agreement for the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area was a historic step in the process of integration of our continent, as it will accelerate the development of inter-African trade as a vehicle for economic recovery, sustainable development, and sustaining peace. Building on this, allow me to make the following observations and ask a question. We know that for the AfCFTA to bear fruit, there is a need to build a continent-wide support program for African industries. The free trade area should in fact be a catalyst for products made in Africa. In your views, what are the main opportunities that you foresee in Africa in the context of the current crisis? In other words, which industrial value chains can Africa nurture in order to build a stronger domestic competitive advantage? And finally, my second observation relates to the need to promote more agricultural development, food security, and the transformation of agribusiness in Africa. Access to food and agriculture security are more important now more than ever, especially in times of crisis. Therefore, we have to draw from national experiences and in fields where we deliver best. Morocco has been able to develop human and technological skills to engage at a large scale in fields of food and agriculture industry, and we remain committed to South-South cooperation with African countries in this field. I thank you very much.
Excellency, thank you very much. I'd just like to make one more announcement, is that please, if anybody has questions from the floor, they should address them in chat to all panelists, and then we'll be able to take the questions on. I might ask at this point in time to follow on what Madame Songwe mentioned about the ingenuity of the African continent. And I believe that one of the issues that we need to consider is that the African continent has the productive capacities in their countries to be able to not only deal with this crisis, but to also deal with the long-term development of the continent. And one of this you will notice, and you will see that many of the countries who will come out of this crisis ahead of others are the ones who have some productive capacity of building on that to be able to diversify their economies and achieve structural transformation. Now, I'm not seeing anybody on the chat, any questions yet. So I just like to ask His Excellency Mr. Muchanga whether he would like to add just a few words in and to address some of the issues that the Moroccan Deputy Perm Representative raised.
Meeting of minds. Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
Yes, yes. When we are looking at agriculture, we are looking at really industrializing agriculture. in the sense that we modernize the process by bringing in machinery and other precision technologies. And in that way, we are increasing productivity and also promote agro-processing so that we are able to keep the products longer and they can reach out to more markets. So that is basically a meeting of minds. There was talk about innovation. One of the decisions made by the heads of state and government is that we must identify and operate trade corridors across Africa. That work is underway. I'm receiving the first draft this evening, and we should be able to get it to the heads of state and government in good time. But one of the messages that is remaining is that coming up is that actually that trade corridor should eventually become the African Continental Free Trade Area trade corridor, such that if in the future we have other pandemics, we can just make use of it straight away. So these are some of the innovations that are coming on. And in working together with the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, again, there's a meeting of minds. If we have to regenerate growth across Africa, the foundation is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So basically, we are on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the floor from Sibanda, and the question I pose to all panelists and is what are the main lessons learned from the 2008 financial crisis that can be applied to the current COVID-19 crisis? Perhaps I might ask Madame Songwe if she could start with some response to that. Well, in that case, if Madame Song is not online, perhaps.
I'm here.
Oh, you are? Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Give us a few minutes to unmute. No, thank you. Look, I think, again, Africa has learned, and it should be no surprise to anybody that Africa is doing much better. The 2008 crisis had three things. It had a food crisis, it had a financial crisis, but it also had an export restrictions crisis. I think that one of the things that the Economic Commission for Africa did, and it was in Stephen's slides as well, is that when we did our first study, we showed that 54 countries were closing their borders, and we immediately started doing advocacy around that. And I think because we started doing advocacy around that, I don't know, many of you may have seen that the president of China, Xi Jinping, yesterday announced that he was going to open humanitarian and health corridors and stop the sort of prevention of exporting health-related and food-related products. So I think the fact that we were able to now know that the first thing we should look at is who is blocking and who is stopping exports and imports into Africa was a very important issue. The second thing that we learned from the 2008 crisis was the food crisis, right? It was a financial crisis, but on the continent, it was also a food crisis. In countries, as I said before, like Guinea, like Senegal, like Ethiopia, we are now working to see whether we can very quickly, double the production of foods products. We're looking at working with AGRA, working with IFAD, working with the FAO, what countries are planting. But more importantly, also looking at storage. 40% of Africa's foods are lost in storage. So what we are doing now is making sure that we can ensure that a lot of the food that is already produced, because in some countries it's already harvested, are not lost in transportation and storage. So again, there we learned. And finally, on the financial sector side, coming out early and asking for the support that Africa needs, $100 billion stimulus, ensuring that there was some debt relief for our countries so that countries could immediately start buying the PPEs. So I would say, all in all, that if one were rethinking Africa and saying, how well did Africa do? Africa has done amazingly well. There's a lot more we need to do, of course. But my sense is that the lessons, and then, of course, Madam Bintia Diop, I think, is on this call, and all of us during the Ebola crisis have learned from that as well. And that's why the response this time around is much better. So Africa has certainly learned, and in some cases is leading, I think, the international response. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Songwe. I think at this point now we only have about 3 minutes left, and I've been informed that we can't overrun. So I would really like to thank the panelists very much for their insight into the discussions that we've had today. Very much indeed. Thank you to His Excellency Albert Muchanga, AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, for the Madame Songwe, Under Secretary General for UN and Executive Secretary of ECA, and to the panelists, the discussants, Mr. Jackie Cilia, and to Dr. Raji. It is a shame that we didn't have Mr. Wamkele, as he's just taken on his new assignment, and he's the one who will have to carry the burden of making sure the CFTA moves and works. But perhaps we'll catch him at another time when we have discussions on this. So I think at this point in time, we can say thank you very much to all the panelists, and have a good afternoon and a good evening, wherever you may be. And perhaps if we have, since we have perhaps one minute, is that I had a question and I wanted to pose it to the panel. Perhaps one of you can quickly answer that. And my concern is very much that in Africa, most of the labor force is in the informal sector. How do we ensure that we do not forget about that labor force in the informal sector? And how do we ensure that the stimulus packages that these countries have are getting to those people as well? Mr. Karingi, would you like to speak to that? Since
Thank you, Chair. Essentially, for the question on the informal sector, what we have been saying at ECA is that, again, the pandemic has exposed the romanticization of the informal sector. And the example we have been giving is that you have a lot of people who have been working in the informal sector, but today you do not know who they are and what they are going through because they are not registered. And so even if you have the stimulus packages and you try to say that you want to give it to the private sector, including the informal sector, you cannot be able to do it because you don't know where they are. So I think the lesson we are learning from this is that let's make sure that this informality is actually minimized or eliminated, so that if we find ourselves in a situation like this, we know how to be able to assist the people who are working in those MSMEs, which end up being, which are usually called the informal sector. So even if we wanted to help now, it is actually very, very difficult. So we need to digitize things and make it simpler and cheaper for the informal sector to be able to register their businesses and for us to know where they are.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. But as you know, the informal sector are always afraid to register themselves because they feel that they'll have to pay taxes. So it's a chicken and egg situation. But I think on that note, we are out of time. I want to thank again once all the panelists and the discussants. I think we've had very interesting dialogue. And I hope we can have it again at a later time when things are better. And we will wish you all a safe trip wherever you may be, and stay safe, and a pleasant morning and a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Akiwumi. And thank you very much for finishing on time.